As I began my once-weekly ritual of briefly logging into social media accounts and then immediately logging out, I couldn't help but notice that quite a few people have issues with episode 4 of Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2.
What?
An episode which, for all intents and purposes, should be about as hype as anything can be. Jujutsu Kaisen is obviously a hugely successful franchise, and this is a pretty pivotal episode in the plot. It's got creative direction, beautifully dynamic animation, tight pacing featuring not only one but two big fights, wonderful music and sound design, etc. In short, it has just about everything one might think conventionally makes a quote-unquote objectively good episode of anime. However, as I said, many seem to be vocally unsatisfied. Most of the complaints and arguments seem to boil down to one question: should pivotally iconic moments from source materials really ever be altered in anime adaptations? I am, of course, at least primarily, referring to the topic of Gojo's Big Buddha moment in his second fight against Papaguro. This scene and this panel from the anime and manga respectively. Why? Because that's what I see most people talking about. However, there are plenty of examples of both big and small changes from the season so far. In this episode, we also miss this iconic shot of Geto's dragon-like curse and Papaguro popping a few more caps off at the two of them. Many details of the ensuing fight as a whole and how it's presented are altered in favor of creative new direction and big set-piece stuff. This is likely to help maintain visual interest as Papaguro gives his exposition dump to Geto. Also, one of Gojo's most manic lines is rearranged and altered slightly. More on that one later, because subtle a change as it may be, it's arguably even more important. So what was actually changed during the scene in question, Gojo's pivotal moment of manic euphoria? Well, the angle and framing have changed, and the background is arguably significantly different. Since this is an anime, there are also a lot more transitional scenes surrounding the moment in question, giving it new context. The line of dialogue itself remains the same. It is a reference after all. Now, if you feel that's a pretty silly level of change to complain about, fair enough. But try to empathize with the other side. Try to keep in mind that this is an integral moment of change in the story, and not just for Gojo. This is possibly the imagery most closely associated with Gojo's transition from an already admittedly overpowered human to the transcendent, calm, collected, big brain, infinite hacks mother trucker we all know and love. The undisputed most powerful Jujutsu sorcerer of his era. This is a huge change not just for Gojo, but for the world of Jujutsu sorcery as a whole. There's a set of connotations, specific emotions, and perceived conveyances that many have come to associate with this moment and this scene as a whole, based on the specific details of the manga itself. Anyway, let's talk about the dang question I'm actually supposed to be exploring, and let's try not to make it a question of manga readers versus non-manga readers, or simply argue over what looks cooler and yell about how spoiled people are. We can manage that, right? Obviously, I have my own personal opinions, but I'm gonna try to be as open-minded to both sides as I can and explore this question with genuine curiosity. So if at any point it seems as if I'm going off the deep end, try to bear with me. There is a purpose, and at least somewhat of an actual answer at the end of it all. Part 1. Change good. On one hand, with changes like this, there could be an opportunity to clarify something not quite apparent in the source material, or to simply bring out more meaning within the subtext of a given moment. In this case, I would argue these changes actually further clarify the dichotomy between Papaguro's pride and Gojo's newfound enlightenment. It also helps juxtapose them both with the enlightenment adjacent but ultimately far more twisted, cult-like trance of the Star Religious group. These could all be described as a sort of manic euphoria to some degree after all. Unyielding pride, tranquil enlightenment, and blissful insanity. In short, there's a lot of religious and spiritual imagery as well as themes. Some tranquil and some twisted, but all further highlighted by Mappa's adaptation. The scene in question's quote, "Throughout heaven and earth, I alone am the honored one," is, after all, a reference to Buddhism, finding its origin in the Lotus Sutra. The Buddha uses this phrase to proclaim himself to be without equal as he sits atop a tower. People will argue endlessly as to what the parallel is originally meant to be between Gojo and the Buddha, but a parallel of some sort is certainly employed by Akutami, whether it be perceived as egotism or enlightenment. However, many probably wouldn't understand the specifics of the reference on its own, but all of this absolutely tranquil nature footage, followed by Gojo surrounded by pillars and backed by light piercing the clouds in a glorious golden glow that almost overtakes the edges of his figure, that speaks to the vibe of the scene quite clearly through aesthetics alone, and it clarifies the idea in a way that pretty much anyone could understand, at least to some degree. Therefore, change good?
That's pretty good, right?
Well, yes, but... Part 2. Change bad. On the other hand, there's an argument to be made for why it's entirely possible to muddle, misunderstand, or just miss the importance of even the slightest detail, as it might turn out to have subtextual meaning or simply be remarkably more important than first realized later. Think Mikasa's brand, for example. A very small detail left out of early Attack on Titan anime scenes, only to eventually turn out to be highly relevant to the world's lore and geographical identities, serving as the seed to a much bigger plot beat concerning one of our main characters much later. Equally relevant, perhaps, is what I've heard some refer to as a question of cultural preservation. Why muddy the waters when working on adaptations or even remakes? Why sow confusion between anime viewers and manga readers? Why convince anime onlys that something unfolded one way if, in the most canonical version of a story, it didn't? Why risk wikis crammed with incorrect or contradictory details and search results pages that lead to information not representative of the original version of a piece of art? Consider that my argument for why maybe anime adaptations should strive to take into account literally every detail of every manga panel, to forego the sort of embarrassing oversights which breed pointless online debates and silly needless plot holes when revisiting series later. Why not just use the manga itself as a sort of proto-storyboard? Why fix what ain't broken at risk of breaking something, right? Well, let's get back to that question later. While I can't think of anything these minor changes could somehow break later, perhaps there is an argument to be made that some of the surrealism implied by the original manga panel is lost, and that although both have a godlike atmosphere about them, one feels much more egotistical, while the other feels much more tranquil and serene. Part 3. Change mid. Along a more middle ground, you might also fail to deliver on the graphical qualities expected of the imagery in a single moment, but then expand upon it further with, for example, more dynamic animation. In this way, you can dazzle the audience with an entirely different aesthetic approach that wasn't even possible in the source material's given medium. I feel the aquarium scene is a perfect example of this. This manga panel is absolutely gorgeous, one of my favorites in the entire series, and I don't think this shot from the anime necessarily does it justice. However, the scene that follows is a jaw-dropping expansion of the moment, which features dynamic qualities that aren't at all possible in the original medium. Part 4. Another change. We could of course argue about any number of other changes in the episode. I mentioned some changes to one of Gojo's lines earlier, for example. In my opinion, these serve to create a much greater change in the actual meaning of the scene. Assuming the translation I'm looking at is accurate, the anime rearranges this dialogue and removes the final line, "You're so right," in exchange for, "Yeah, maybe so." Almost as if to soften the sense of manic euphoria or insanity in the line. Judging by the structure of the actual text bubbles in the manga, as well as Akutami's little post-chapter illustration, where he often likes to add explanations and jokes, this seems like a pretty clear-cut alteration of the line and its original delivery. Originally, he starts at one extreme, questioning Papaguro, then slowly works his way to the other extreme, complete and seemingly excited agreement with him. This scene is also reframed from a new angle as well, and I'd argue that in tandem these changes greatly detract from the original sense of insanity in the moment, in order to lean towards making Gojo's dialogue a bit more natural, and perhaps more in line with the anime version of the scene's sense of pure enlightenment, as opposed to a sort of enlightened insanity. While I'm typically a bit of a purist with this sort of thing, valuing direct translations infinitely more than localizing things like references and slang for Westerners, while I realize there's a good bit of controversy surrounding the official translations of the Jujutsu Kaisen manga, even if the translation I'm referring to is quote-unquote wrong, no matter what disclaimer I might preface this with, it still illustrates my key point pretty cut and dry. What's interesting here is that even the very slightest change in the arrangement and delivery of the line alters what is conveyed in the moment significantly. The silver lining to both changes is of course that there's now a clear, simple and clean sense of unity throughout the entire scene in this adaptation. Everything has an atmosphere of tranquil, godlike serenity. There's very little to confuse or muddle, at least the anime's interpretation of the scene. Part 5. Adaptation. I've often asked myself the question, is anime ever truly canon? Yeah, we're going there. Or is it merely an extremely entertaining, engaging, and meaningful distortion of the original? Anime does, after all, inevitably pass through the hands of more and more artists, directors, producers, etc., who are not the author. And not every detail of every somewhat confusing or open-ended scene or abstract ability can warrant a phone call with a busy mangaka or even that mangaka's editors to clarify what every bit of subtext should mean and how every transition scene between panels should play out.
Don't come crying to me for everything!
In almost every case, outside of one-to-one moving manga-style adaptations, if we're being realistic, we must admit that things will be changed, things will be added, and things will be taken away. And these alterations will, in almost every case, risk altering how things are perceived, in much the same way that adding voiced lines and new dimensions to adaptations of simpler, retro games will. That's simply the nature of adaptation, especially when moving to a far less abstract medium or level of detail. As our primary example and subject here goes, we're not talking about anything all that distorted. I don't think at any point they trampled all over the themes of the manga. We're also not talking about censorship. We're not talking about inserting one's ideology into a translation, or Western localization to transform the Japanese language into Zoomer slang. This is something very different. At the end of the day, I think a lot of the Jujutsu Kaisen changes may simply boil down to not better, not worse, just different. It's important to keep in mind that when one adapts a manga to a kinetic medium like animation, one absolutely has to think of entirely new dimensions, new elements, and quote-unquote rules. The particular ways to transition from scene to scene smoothly, for example. The way one makes anime effortless to watch is often totally different from the way one makes manga effortless to read. Scenes are often reframed so that the eyes line up naturally, cut to cut, for example. That's without getting into balancing composition in a shot of animation, something which is arguably far less important when it comes to manga panels, which vary wildly in size, shape, and flow. And of course, there are whole new elements that unfold within the new medium. Dynamic motion, timing, sound design, music, how actors deliver and intonate their lines, etc. This can all change how one might perceive the meaning or vibe or even the coolness factor of something big or small. This is to say little of the simple fact that manga is inherently more abstract than animation, and in many cases, clarifying details and changes simply must be implemented to get from panel to panel without adding further confusion. Whether the changes present in this episode fully clarify the originally intended meaning, which is arguably more open to interpretation, it at least clarifies an intended meaning, even if that's the interpretation of a larger team at work and not an individual mangaka. As stated earlier, it also offers a new sense of cohesion to the scene as a whole, giving it one very particular tranquil atmosphere that is in no way emotionally confusing or at odds with itself. Part 6. Chainsaw Man changes. Now that is not to say that I'm all too forgiving of any and all anime adaptation changes simply because some changes have to be made, even in series I love, even when the adaptation's production qualities are extremely impressive. I loved Chainsaw Man Season 1. However, the sort of fourth wall breaking curse effects reaching in from outside of the manga pages have thus far not made it into the anime, at least not with their original effect fully intact. And replacing them with impressive, but quite frankly totally plain fighting animation sequences is pretty weak sauce on Mappa's part, in an otherwise mostly stellar adaptation. I realize a lot of people think that this is literally one of the best scenes from the anime, but in my opinion, this is what it looks like to play it safe, with something you should have taken creative risks on. There are all sorts of clever ways this could have been handled. Aspect ratio shifts, film strips with slow-mo, etc.
We already have a ghostly hand that just does stuff. You have to break the fourth wall to convey this curse thing properly.
That's not even to touch on why I think Episode 2 is a much weaker attempt at further introducing and developing Makima as a character when compared to Chapter 2 of the manga. There's frankly no comparison for me. Manga Makima's introduction is just infinitely more intriguing, providing an almost immediate insight into just how cold, calculated, teasing, and frankly selfish she can be under the right circumstances. She deprives Denji of his first real meal in order to send him to fight a devil alone, on what seems like his first day as a free man, because she doesn't want her noodles to get cold. Compare that to how she's portrayed in the anime version. Kind words, thigh pillows, and all. They seem to have thought having her repeat this line would somehow make up for removing all of this. Now there's an alteration that drastically changes the connotations of a scene, its characterization, and how one might perceive the episodes surrounding it. And yet all people talk about is how a fight they thought was boring anyway got cut. Truly, this is the level at which most shonen fans engage with art. The original chapter itself is almost completely devoid of the needless levels of mystery box nonsense that so many shonen today depend far too heavily on to maintain interest, even if in this case it is in the name of cinematic subtlety. The thing that makes this sting all the more for me is that I consider one of Chainsaw Man's greatest selling points to be that it handles twists, cliffhangers, and mystery elements in a very different way than other twisting, turning mystery box shonen. It seems to always lay the seeds for its twists, turns, and character developments early and in plain sight, and often uses the cliffhanger technique as the butt of a joke. But once again, I'm not sure either of those is equivalent to this episode's changes either. And once again, I still really enjoyed Season 1. Part 7, Call of the Night changes. As for a recent example of an anime with some fairly drastic visual changes and expansions that undoubtedly improve upon and highlight the spirit of the original, I would like to quickly point to a little romantic comedy called Call of the Night. In the anime, every nightscape-style shot is perfectly lit and filled with colorful, nebula-like overlays. This is true even when realistically, the city lights should obscure the night sky, thanks to something called light pollution. The thing is, that's pretty much totally irrelevant to the black and white manga, where most of the backgrounds are either empty or filled with dark gradients with a few small white stars. The mangaka likely never even considered this a question, given their medium. Extended scenes will play out for what feel like minutes at a time of just Ko and/or Nazuna traversing the city's most aesthetic locations, backed by nothing more than some of the most vibin' music you've ever heard. The anime's aesthetic changes bring a newly unrealistic but dazzling, captivating sense of magic to the night, in a series which is all about, well, the Call of the Night. That's not even to get into many of the other interesting new direction techniques used throughout the anime. For example, when we meet this crew of new vampires, we find out that they're all basically obsessed with quote-unquote popularity power and being as seductive as possible to acquire new mates and prey.
We're adept at acting in ways that attract humans. That's how we've evolved.
But the anime in particular doesn't just tell us that. It has these quick fan-servicey animation jump cuts to show us just how methodically characters like Midori think about every little move they make, in a constant attempt to draw men's eyes to them and increase their sexual appeal and popularity power. The same technique is used to draw attention not just to sexual mannerisms, but also when a character really wants something they say to draw attention and evoke a sense of importance. How much of this comes from the manga? Exactly none of it. Part 8. In conclusion. This is obviously the part where I'm supposed to tell you that I, as a #professional YouTuber, have some sure and universal answer to the question in the title, but short of saying some changes must be made and that I'd have to judge them on a case-by-case basis, it's difficult to pretend that I have that particular type of answer. I do know that many of the greatest adaptations are great because of their countless changes to presentation.
I'll take a potato chip and eat it.
But I also know that plenty of adaptations have failed to truly and fully capture the spirit of their source materials because they strive to alter too much, or alter things without understanding the appeal of the original. At the end of the day, perhaps it comes down to a question of risk versus reward. An adaptation can take no risks and settle for a faithful, one-to-one, moving manga-style adaptation, but in most cases, that means settling for a certain level of mediocrity, bringing many of the inherent limitations of the manga medium along with you into a medium where those limitations don't exist. I'm absolutely not saying a less dynamic, more moving manga-esque adaptation, or just something that focuses more on graphical detail or painterly aesthetics over dynamics and the like, can't be great when paired with things like good story and music. I'm also not saying that a straight-up moving manga-style adaptation can't use the resources they save in this way to focus on things like variable line width, strong aesthetic choices, varied artistic styles, etc. But if you want to create an anime adaptation that stands at the peak, considered great for truly elevating its source material to new heights and taking advantage of all of the strengths of, well, animation, you're probably going to need to take some bold risks. For example, I may have trashed some of the decisions surrounding the Chainsaw Man adaptation earlier, and those decisions obviously came with those risks. However, the risks taken by changing and greatly expanding upon some of what were quite short fight scenes in the manga brought to life what I consider some of the most hype anime scenes in recent history. For all the downsides that might come along with it, perhaps that's a risk worth taking. But what do you think?
忘れちゃいけない。にゃ